Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Fishing with Rod. We're not fishing today, but I am just as excited. Today, we're spending some time with Dr. Eric Taylor. We also know him as Rick. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for coming back again.
Yeah, we've known each other for about 20 years now. I think I took one of your undergrad courses back in the early 2000s, which is the biology of fish, I believe.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think I remember you were one of the top students in that year.
That would be a lie, because
No, I don't think so.
In my opinion, I think I was actually a pretty lazy student. But I thoroughly enjoyed the course because fish is my passion, and that's what I'm quite excited about today. We're spending the day at the Beaty Biodiversity Museum, and I thought it was quite fitting that we should be talking about the diversity of freshwater fishes in British Columbia, which is your specialty.
It is indeed. It's
Yeah.
my passion as well, although I love to fish for them as well.
Yeah. And you're the curator for the museum when it comes to the fish.
That's right.
Right.
That's correct.
And Rick's brought some samples to show us today, and hopefully we'll be talking about lots of interesting facts about fish.
For sure.
Yeah. I guess the first thing to ask you is, how many freshwater fish species do we have in British Columbia?
That's a good question. We recognize about 70 species of native freshwater fishes that all have a separate name.
Right. And would you say that's pretty diverse, or?
Well, compared to say Ontario, that has over about 200.
Oh, okay. Well,
So we're a little on the low end.
less, yeah.
And of course, if you go down to the southern U.S. or Mexico, Central America, there's hundreds of species down there.
Yeah. So I actually grew up in the tropics, and I spent quite a few years in Australia during my teen years.
Amazing,
So
yeah.
the diversity of fish, in my opinion, is huge in those areas.
It certainly
before
is.
moving here, and then when I first moved to this area, I've only known the salmon, the trout, but over the years, through your studies and just from fishing, I've started learning more and more about the freshwater fish species. So.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, and I've spent some time in Australia, and of course Southeast Asia has just a huge diversity. But when most people talk about diversity of fishes, they conjure up in their mind some incredibly diverse coral reef.
Yeah.
And there's no question that I've dove on coral reefs in the Indo-West Pacific, or people who do it in the Caribbean. It's unbelievably amazing because there's one little fish using every little space on the reef.
Yeah.
But as a matter of fact, per unit area, like you think of the Earth, freshwaters comprise less than 0.01% of all surface area of water on Earth.
Right.
Yet they have 40% of all described fishes.
Okay.
So per unit area, freshwaters are about 40 times more diverse than the comparable area in the marine realm.
Oh wow.
So freshwater fishes are incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned, it's places like the Amazon and Southeast Asia that have the vast majority of that freshwater fish diversity. But we have some pretty cool fish in BC as well.
We do, yeah. So you mentioned earlier in Ontario they have over 200 species of freshwater fish, whereas we have about 70. So what are the differences between the two?
That's very interesting. Well, both areas were completely glaciated. A 2-kilometer thick sheet of ice covered all that freshwater fish habitat up to around 10 or 15,000 years ago. The difference is that Ontario, when the ice left there, it was reseeded or recolonized by really the center of freshwater fish diversity in North America, which is the Mississippi Basin. Whereas fish to get into BC, of course, had the Rocky Mountains to get through, which some made it through, but some didn't because the ice left too late. And also a lot of our fish are just surrounded, isolated from other areas, either by the sea, the freshwater, so they couldn't go from freshwater, say in Washington or Oregon, out into the sea, then back into freshwater. Or the mountains, of course, isolated them. So that's usually the reason.
Right. So very geographical barriers that kind of constrain them to I guess diversify.
That's right. I mean, Canada is a country of fish immigrants. All the fish we have, if you go out and survey fish in any area of Saskatchewan, PEI, or British Columbia, all those fish came from somewhere else as recently as 10,000 years ago.
Okay, so relatively new.
Relatively new.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, of course, the species were older. They were just living south of the ice sheet, not in Canada.
And when it comes to anadromy, I guess salmon and even trout going into the ocean, I mean, how does that? When did that happen? How does that happen?
Well, they in British Columbia, salmon and sea run trout like steelhead trout or cutthroat trout, They survived the last glaciation when ice just completely eliminated all the freshwater habitat we have now, either north of the ice sheet in sort of the lower Yukon River area that was ice-free, or south of the ice sheet in coastal areas of Washington and Oregon, particularly the lower Columbia River. So our salmon in the Fraser River, say, would have come from one of those two sources.
Okay.
By, they could complete their life history when the ice was in British Columbia, in the lower Columbia, or up in the lower Yukon. And then when the ice left British Columbia, those fish naturally dispersed back into the Fraser River, say, or along the coast, or from the north along the coast, and also sometimes down into the Fraser River and Vancouver Island.
Right.
So anadromy, the ability to go to sea, is associated with much wider distribution of fishes than freshwater fishes that cannot go to sea. So there are lots of freshwater fishes that are only found in one tiny little area because they're trapped by the surrounding landscape, and they can't go to the sea because they'll shrivel up like a prune.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, so it's going back a little bit. So I remember when taking your undergrad course, one of the first questions was, what is a fish species? I think we should clarify that a little bit.
Yes.
How do you define a species in general, actually? Yeah.
Well, most people would say a fish species, two individuals you have are different species if they look different. And that's basically the way most people recognize two things as being different. Although there are a lot of fish species that we recognize now that look very, very similar to each other, such as Dollyvarden and bull trout, that were all considered to be one species at one time, that when you look at them genetically are actually very, very different from one another. Very, very different from one another. And we basically describe a species as a population that is reproductively isolated from other such populations, which means they either don't interbreed with the other population, or if they do, their offspring don't survive and don't reproduce. That's what most people consider to be two valid species or two biological species.
Okay, great, yeah.
So interbreeding is key, or the lack thereof.
Right.
Distinguishes two species.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to bring up Fraser River Chinook salmon, just because that's kind of the hot topic right now for everybody, right?
Sure.
So in the Fraser River, we have quite a few different, several populations of Chinook salmon. Some are doing really well, some are not doing so well. They're kind of isolated from each other. Would they be able to interbreed and produce viable offspring?
Yes, they would.
Yeah.
Now, of course, they often don't, simply because of the homing tendency of salmon. So they'll return to different streams, and therefore they have no opportunity to interbreed Chinook salmon in one population and Chinook salmon in another population. Chinook salmon in the Nechako River versus Chinook salmon in Slim Creek in the Upper Fraser. They're not going to interbreed with each other simply because they're physically isolated because they home. But if you brought them into the lab, which I did a lot of that work in my PhD several decades ago, you bring Chinook salmon from two populations into the lab, you crossbreed them, and their young survive just fine.
Okay. So my next question would be, okay, so if they can survive well in the lab, what about in nature?
Well, that's
so if you let's say the Nechako Chinook salmon eventually become extinct, and we bring the shoe sharp Chinook salmon and trying to repopulate that run, would that work?
It could work.
Yeah.
I think the history of transplantation, particularly, and this was mostly in terms of sockeye salmon, which in many ways have a sort of more specialized life history because of that dependency on living in lakes for sometimes. And the migrations from the spawning streams into the lakes for sockeye can be extremely complex. So if you don't match that sort of behavior exactly right when you're transplanting, it's going to fail. But it could work, and the only, if you have no other alternative, that is that they're completely extinct in a river, then certainly transplantation is one option. And as long as you monitor it and consider it an experiment and sort of adaptively tweak how you do it, it can work. And I believe that the Chilliwack River, which is, I know, close to your heart, has transplanted Chinook salmon from the Upper Fraser in it. So there's a situation where it worked.
Yeah.
Sockeye, it almost never works because that codependence of the stream and its orientation towards the lake, that migration has to be just perfect.
Right, okay. So genetically, each population, they're very different, somewhat different from each other, right?
Yes.
Okay, so why is it so important to, I mean, we, as fishermen, when we fish out in the ocean, we look at a Chinook salmon, that's a Chinook salmon. We don't really differentiate between this is that particular run.
But some fishermen do.
Some fishermen do, yeah. I mean, they look fairly similar.
Yes,
right?
for
As
sure.
a consumer, you think of salmon as salmon.
Yes.
So why is it so important to, I guess, kind of preserve each population? the genetic integrity of each population. Yeah.
Well, I'll give you two reasons. The first reason is that genetic difference is part of the biological legacy of British Columbia. It's what makes British Columbia different than Ontario or Saskatchewan. We not only have Chinook salmon, but we have some Chinook salmon that migrate to sea as 0+ fish, little guys like this, say in the Harrison River. And we have other Chinook salmon that come from the upper Fraser that migrate when they're over a year old. So it's part of our biological heritage, which I think is important for just sort of aesthetic reasons to conserve. The second reason is, and this has been very well demonstrated in the Bristol Bay sockeye salmon fishery, the largest commercial salmon fishery in the world.
Yeah.
This year they had something crazy like over 60 million fish return. We know that people have looked at what's the stability of the population over a number of decades, the stability of the catch. So the actual economic return to fishers in the fishery. What is the economic return and the stability of the size if you have one homogeneous population, say every single fish matures at 4 years of age, and they all come in at exactly the same time, versus a diversity where you have 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and 4-year-olds returning over a much longer time period during the summer. And the stability of the population, because the environment's changing from year to year. Some years, 4-year-olds are going to do better than 3-year-olds, either in the ocean or in the spawning environment. And these authors from the University of Washington showed very clearly that if you maintain that diversity, it's like a stock portfolio. Your stock portfolio goes up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. What you don't want is the ups and downs and ups and downs. One homogeneous population, ups and downs, ups and downs. Lots of fisheries closures every 2 or 3 years. If you have a variable population that can handle the environmental variation, just bops along, bops along, bops along like that, you have only 4 closures over 100 years versus a closure every 2 or 3 years. Maintaining diversity maintains the species across the landscape, and you're going to get more consistent return and more benefits to people.
So I guess that's kind of a insurance policy.
Exactly.
Say,
exactly. Yeah. It's like your stock portfolio. Don't put it all in one thing. Keep it diversified so that if one component of the economy goes down, the other one is maintaining your value.
Yeah. Okay, so you brought some fish.
I did.
You want to show us some
certainly,
examples?
Certainly.
We're doing some show and tell today.
People sometimes ask me, what's your favorite fish? And I say, I don't have one. I have sort of a top 10 list, and sometimes it varies. Some drop out and some. So I've just got some here from British Columbia, most of them are from British Columbia, that I think exhibit, are good examples of how strange, weird, and wonderful freshwater fishes are. Now the first one here might be a little scary for people who are of the younger age set. This is known as the Pacific lamprey, which can grow to about 1 meter long. And you notice it looks very snaky-like and fish-like, eel-like. Now, the interesting thing about this fish is, there's 2 really cool things about the Pacific lamprey. The first thing is, it's a descendant of the oldest lineage of vertebrates on Earth.
Okay.
It's one of the first fishes to move off the vertebrate line. The other thing is, well, we'll have to get a close-up of this later, but it's an external parasite. So it uses this circular mouth, it's got some very sharp teeth, and it attaches to the sides of fish and uses those teeth and a rasping tongue to bore in and out of the fish to live. And sometimes that can cause considerable levels of mortality in fish like salmon and trout living in the ocean.
Yeah. Okay, so I've seen I believe it's Westbrook lamprey, which are
Western Brook lamprey.
Western Brook, so which are much smaller.
Much smaller.
And I've seen them attached to salmons before.
Yep.
A lamprey that size, what would it be attaching to?
Well, it would attach to an adult Chinook salmon or
really?
Wow. And there are ones in Cowichan Lake, the only place in the world where they're found, a derivative, an offshoot of this Pacific lamprey that get to about maybe that long.
Yeah.
And they're definitely scar mark. Anyone who's fished in Cowichan Lake occasionally gets as a cutthroat or coastal cutthroat or a Dolly Varden with a scar mark on it. It'll have a scar like the size of a quarter or a dime where that fish has survived. But a lot of fish die from these wounds because it basically just bores a hole in the side of them.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And these are anadromous too.
These are anadromous. That's right.
Okay. When do they usually spawn?
These are fall spawners.
Okay.
So these have been exploited for millennia by First Nations peoples going up,
really?
The Skeena and the Fraser River. Oh yeah, and particularly in the Columbia River as well.
And for consumption.
For eating. Oh yeah,
really?
They're very good. Smoked, smoked lamprey is very good.
Okay.
Yep.
Wow, didn't know that.
I think it was King Henry VIII died apparently from eating a surfeit of lampreys, which is one of the European species. He ate so many of them they used to make something called lamprey pie. But apparently he got pretty intense gastrointestinal problems. So they're good, but you can't eat too many of them.
Yeah. Okay. Nice.
Now here's, of course, one of my favorite fish. for a totally different reason. So this is a seahorse. We don't have these in British Columbia, but we do have a very close relative, which is the bay pipefish. Now, what sort of distinguishes these fish from many other fishes is they have a very hard, bony exterior. Now, the other thing that's really interesting about the seahorse is it's the only fish that I know of, 35,000 species, that swims standing up.
Vertically, yeah.
They swim like this. Their whole body axis, imagine, no way it can swim like this.
No.
And it just swims with the little teeny fins up here, the pectoral fins, and along the dorsal fin. And the males are the ones that carry the offspring to birth. So male pregnancy. So that's another really cool reason. So a bay pipefish is like this. It's just been turned this way and stretched out.
Right. And you say they're closely related?
They're closely related, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one's from, so where's that seahorse from?
This seahorse is from somewhere in Indonesia. I'm not exactly sure.
Because I think seahorse is like that in Australia.
Definitely. There's lots in Australia.
Yeah.
And there's some that mature at the pygmy seahorse is tiny little thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, these are sort of Indo-West Pacific tropical fishes mostly. And this is the north temperate derivative. Now this is another very, very unusual fish. Now many of your viewers will recognize this thing as the Starry Flounder.
Yeah.
Now the reason why this fish is so cool is because when they're first born, I'm going to bring up an example here that's not quite, I'll bring up this guy. They more or less look like a regular fish. In other words, they're oriented in the sort of horizontal direction. They've got an eye on either side of the head, and they swim like this.
So that's not a juvenile.
No. This is I'm just using the example more of how the body is formed. Now, at some point in time, these fish metamorphose, and what happens is you'll notice that the eyes are on the same side of the head. So the eye migrates. In this case, it's its top eye. It migrates from this side of the head to the same side of the head as the other eye, and the optic nerves cross. The fish turns on its one side like this, loses all the color on this side, maintains the color on this side, and settles to the bottom and lives on the bottom like this. It's perfect for living on the bottom.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to really be living in the water column swimming like this so much. So this radical metamorphosis is amazing.
It is.
How they do that. Now, the other interesting thing about the Starry Flounder is there's so-called right eye and left eye flounders, and how you tell is you hold the fish up like this, and is the dark side on the right side or on the left side? Now, some of these populations of these fish are like this, right side, and other fish are, they'd be like this, the left side of the flounder. So they're pretty strange.
So, so Starry Flounders, I know halibut has similar mechanism and all that, right? But Starry Flounders are found in the estuaries as well, even freshwater.
Yes, they are. Yeah, for sure.
So, funny story for you. A friend of mine, an avid angler, actually caught one near Hope.
Oh, yeah, really?
As high up as Hope.
Holy
one year.
doodle.
Yeah, this is many years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
well,
I thought it was quite interesting.
Yeah, that's amazing. I didn't, wow. Huh.
Yeah.
Do you want to see some more? I got two more.
Go for it.
Okay. Well, this is, of course, one of my favorite fish as well. And this is a juvenile Chinook salmon. And the thing I love about them is they're beautiful in life. Of course, they're not so beautiful when they're still pretty nice looking when they've been stuck in alcohol for 30 or 40 years. But I just love the sort of blue, greenish backs on them and those beautiful power marks along the side. And the other thing that amazes me is that a little fish like this, it starts out its life even smaller, can travel all the way down from basically the western edge of the Rocky Mountains in the upper Fraser, swim all the way out into the ocean, thousands of kilometers, to come back as a 100-pound fish. It's just absolutely remarkable, and they're just stunningly beautiful fish.
And actually, I was thinking about that last night. When it comes to steelhead, a juvenile fish has to reach a certain size in the river, and then it goes into the ocean, this massive water body, and randomly happens to hit a certain amount of food to survive. Otherwise, it wouldn't survive. And eventually will make the way back, and the chance of that survival is tiny.
It's if you stop and
amazing.
think about it, it's kind of like thinking about the origin of the Earth. It's just really difficult to comprehend. I mean, the salmon migration of all the species in the North Pacific, I argue, is the greatest animal migration on the face of the Earth. It's incredible. People talk about the Serengeti, the wildebeest. That's amazing. The monarch butterfly, that's amazing too. But all those salmon coming from freshwater out into the ocean in their tens of millions back to around the Pacific Rim, unbelievable.
Yeah, because once we get out into the Pacific, we really don't know what's going on out there, right?
No, particularly in the open ocean. We're learning a lot more about, that's not what I do, but people are learning a lot more about what these fish do in near coastal areas for sure, but you're definitely right. It's kind of a bit of a black box.
Yeah. And it's a fluid situation because, the environment is changing pretty fast right now. and
That's right.
and they have to adapt to that. So I guess we're playing catch up all the time.
We're playing catch up.
Yeah.
That's right. Now the last ones I wanted to show you are these, which again we'll have to see
I've heard this story before.
up close. But these things are a couple of centimeters long.
Yeah.
And these are the so-called Benthic on the top and Limnetic 3-spine sticklebacks that are found only in 5 lakes in southwestern British Columbia. Nowhere else in the
Nowhere
world.
else, yeah.
Despite the fact that the regular 3-spine stickleback is found all around the whole Arctic, in the northern hemisphere, in freshwaters and nearshore marine habitats. Now, the interesting thing about this is, going back to our discussion about species, is these two things, they're clearly different from each other. These are both mature adults, both males. One is much bigger than the other, and one is sort of more robust bodied, thicker bodied, that sort of thing. They live in different parts of these small lakes. This guy lives out in the middle of the lake. This guy lives inshore and feeds on benthic invertebrates. So this one lives on plankton. In the spring, they come together along the shore, but they don't interbreed with each other.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And these are all right now, so these are distinct biological species like we were talking about before. Yeah. And right now, we think we're in the process of naming them as separate species.
Right.
So right now, they're not really recorded in the list of all different species names. So those 70 that are in BC, they're not included. But they're separate than all other 3-spine sticklebacks. So right. BC, my point is, BC has a lot of hidden or so-called cryptic biodiversity that we're still attaching scientific names to.
Okay. Yeah.
And these are some of the youngest species on Earth. Remember, the ice covered their lakes 10,000 years ago. They evolved within the last 10,000 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah. So at this moment right now, do they share the same genus and species name?
They do.
They do. Okay.
Gasterosus aculeatus,
okay.
if you're into that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So a colleague and I, Dolph Schluter, is the colleague who's, of course, done some fantastic work on these fish in terms of the ecology and genetics of speciation. We're wrestling right now with if we should name them separately and what should the name be. Because which one, if any of them, is Gasterosus aculeatus, and what do you call the other ones? What we do know is you put them in a tank with each other, and they won't breed with each other.
Even in the lab.
Even in the lab. Particularly if you give them a choice. If you give the big guy a choice with between a little girl and a big girl, he'll always go. Not always. The vast majority of the time, he'll always mate with the big girl like himself.
Oh wow, yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah. It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Evolved within 10,000 years. You don't have to go to study cichlids in the Rift Lakes of Eastern Africa. You can do it here.
Yeah.
So that's my top pick for some unusual fish that are found around here.
Yeah. And the 3-spine sticklebacks are pretty interesting. I think I showed you a video a couple years ago where there was an anadromous sticklebacks migrating up the Fraser by the thousands, right along the shoreline. And the Fraser itself, it's a very large water body that we think salmon migrates through it, but there are many other freshwater fish species.
And it's interesting. How many times have you been fishing on the Fraser River in your life? Hundreds, probably.
Yeah.
Is that the first time you've seen that?
That was the first time I've seen it.
Yeah, and that's amazing. Every time you go out, these fish surprise us.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I come across many species.
Sure.
American shad is one of them. I've seen them.
I wanted to ask you about that. Do you see those commonly?
So even up to about 15 years ago, we found them in the summertime every now and then.
Wow.
Not very common, but I would say 2 or 3 every summer.
Oh, that's okay. I didn't realize they were that common.
So I'd say it's relatively common, I guess. Wow. Yeah.
Well, I think they're knocking at the door, because here's an interesting statistic for you. The number of American shad that are, remember, from the east coast of North America, introduced to the Sacramento, San Joaquin, spread into the Columbia, they number in the millions in the Columbia.
Yeah,
they're the most abundant anadromous fish in the Columbia. And some people think they're now the iconic fish of the Columbia River, which absolutely appalls me.
Yeah.
It should be salmon.
Yeah.
Not American shad.
So you think as environment changes, would they make their way up into this area?
Why aren't they, if they're so abundant in the Columbia, and we know things like white sturgeon go back and forth between the Columbia Fraser, why haven't they? There must be something keeping them from here.
Yeah.
And certainly one central idea would be its water temperature just has to change a little bit more. It could be the flow regime in the lower Columbia versus the lower Fraser as well. That's entirely possible.
Yeah.
Or the presence of some predator or something. But we got to keep our eye on that, because they'll just overwhelm the place.
Right.
They could overwhelm the place.
So just backtrack a little bit. American shad, it's not a native species on the west coast
That's
of
correct.
North America. It's an east coast species.
That's right.
And it was introduced to West Coast. How long ago would that be?
I think late 1800s.
Okay,
So the Sacramento, San Joaquin. So they spread all the way up to the Columbia.
Okay, well, that's
And, as you
quite a
say,
while
in the
ago.
Fraser.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
And they're delicious fish.
I never tried it, so
No, I've had them when I was in the East Coast.
Okay.
They're good, but
So
they belong in the East Coast.
how would you prepare them? Yeah.
Just basically just bake them.
Yeah.
Bake them or barbecue them. They're a little bony. They're a little more difficult to prepare because the meat's a bit flakier, but they're good.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
fun.
So speaking of, I guess invasive species, we've been talking about native species, and then bring up American shad, which is an invasive or introductory species.
Yep.
There are quite a few of them in British Columbia as well. We're talking about bass, carp,
Yep.
and brown bullhead.
Brown bullhead. All three bullheads.
Yeah, and there's quite a few other ones.
Yep.
And there's been an emphasis on that invasive species are bad. And as anglers, I think we tend to be confused by what exactly are invasive
Right.
and what's native.
Right.
Because a lot of people fish for bass, and they tend to think, well, bass are good, so why are they considered as invasive?
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting question. That's much more complex than I thought several years ago. So, I will admit, when it comes to fishes, I'm a nativist.
Yeah.
I believe that the fish that live in British Columbia as a result of natural processes are part of what makes British Columbia special. And there's this concept of faunal homogenization. That is, the movement of animals and plants all around the world is making areas less different than they were before. So if you value that sort of natural heritage, then non-native species that come into British Columbia, whether or not they do harm or not, and that's typically what an invasive species is defined as, is one that's not only not native, but it actually harms the native fauna. Whether or not you think that's a good thing or not to have largemouth and smallmouth bass here for angling opportunities in BC, or brook trout that depends a lot on what you feel about the natural bioheritage of British Columbia. And I realize that's a personal value, but I'm putting it out there. I'm strongly in favor of having only native fish here, except in cases where you really can isolate the fish, say in a totally isolated lake, and the fish are sterile, so even if they do get out, they're not going to at least interbreed with native fishes. Of course, you get situations where interbreeding isn't the issue, but predation. So there's some concern in the lower Fraser that things like black crappie, smallmouth bass, and the bullheads or catfishes, could do a number on all those little salmon juveniles that are using the very critical area of the lower Fraser for feeding areas and saltwater acclimation areas before they go out to the ocean.
Right.
They get stuck in those little sloughs, and a brown bullhead comes up, it's going to suck them down pretty fast.
Right. Establishment of these populations are relatively new. We're only talking about the last couple of decades when it comes to bass, and even now you find largemouth bass in the lower Veda River. Cultus Lake has smallmouth bass. Nickelman Slough has largemouth bass, and we've seen some really big specimens in there. And the impacts are not really known at this point,
That's right.
I mean, how they impact the native salmon and trout, we wouldn't really know until a few decades from now. Or even then, we might even know.
Might not even know. I mean, that's why it is. If this is something that's important to people, it's one of the possible threats to native fish that we really care about, like juvenile salmon. So someone has to be watching. That's the important thing. But there are definitely cases where the introduction of an introduced species has wiped out a local fish. So the yellow bullhead got into Hadley Lake on Lasqueti Island, and we had a so-called species pair of these sticklebacks. That was one of the lakes that had a species pair on Hadley or Pete's Lake on Lasqueti Island, and within 2 years they completely wiped them out. So the native three-spine sticklebacks, the Benthic and Limnetic, that are sort of now textbook examples of speciation, only occur in British Columbia. An invasive fish got in there and ate them all. Another case where crayfish were put into another one of these lakes on near Nanoose Bay on Vancouver Island. Crayfish, American single crayfish, got into the lake, and there's two types of sticklebacks, the fat benthic and the long, skinny limnetic. The crayfish has caused a disturbance of the habitat such that now the two species are now merged into a single hybrid swarm. So we've lost that diversity too because of an invasive, in this case, an invasive species.
Right.
Even though lots of people like to eat crayfish, I'm sure they're delicious.
Yeah.
But they're in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah.
Because the sticklebacks had never evolved with them. It was a totally novel predator or novel change to their environment. They couldn't handle it, and they collapsed into a hybrid swarm.
Yeah.
So we've lost that maiden BC diversity.
Exactly. Yeah. And that kind of brings up the point that I think people value fish very differently, right? As a biologist, you value fish very differently to someone who buys a fish from the supermarket. So someone might say, okay, so we lost a couple populations of sticklebacks. What's the big deal? Because we don't eat them.
Yeah,
right.
That's right.
But the genetic makeup of those fish, is a product of tens and hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah.
Is lost within a couple of years, just like what you say, right? And I think that's pretty unfortunate.
But sure. And a good analogy I like to use is if you went into an art museum and got rid of all the Group of Seven Canadian Group of Seven paintings. And who cares? I never go to the art museum. I don't really. What value does it? It doesn't create jobs or anything like that. Well, it does because it creates a need for a museum. But that's part of our national heritage. It's now been lost. Even though we don't eat paintings.
Yeah.
But it's a tragic loss. So,
right.
so fish are kind of the same thing. They're a museum record of our biological history in British Columbia.
Yeah, and that's kind of the point I'm trying to get across to my viewers all the time is to understand and value every single fish species, not just the ones that you love to catch. And, it's amazing to catch a steelhead and whatnot, but appreciate the little ones and little sculpins, little sticklebacks. And
think about what are the salmon and steelhead eating in the ocean?
Yeah.
What are the little surf smelts and all those little tiny fish, brown? What are those beautiful rainbow trout? Some of those interior lakes eating. A lot of them are eating red-side shiners. You're never going to eat a red-side shiner when it gets to be that big. But the fish we value depend on a whole food web beneath them. And a lot of that food web is composed of so-called little brown fish that no one's ever going to catch or no one's rarely ever going to see. But they're critical to maintaining the fish we do value.
Yeah, definitely, And talk about appreciating native species like you. I kind of have the similar view. Is that you go to the Great Lakes, there's Pacific salmon and there's steelhead in there, and people boast about them. And to me, I think that's disastrous. I mean,
it is.
There are native species in those lakes. I mean, if I remember correctly, those ones are not doing as well because of the introduction of the other species as well.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, Atlantic salmon were native to Lake Ontario.
Yeah.
And of course, some beautiful, large, gorgeous lake trout and this whole sort of so-called species flock of different whitefishes. A lot of those were decimated by invasion of a sea lamprey from the Atlantic coast that got in there. And then once those desired large-bodied salmon and trout and char fishes went down the tubes, people started trying to restore them and trying to control the lamprey. But then someone had the bright idea, well, wait a minute, Pacific salmon evolved with this Pacific lamprey that I showed you. Let's put them in the lake and see how they do. And of course, they took off like crazy. And as you mentioned, people were leaving their jobs at lunchtime in Lake Michigan and going down and catching 20-pound coho salmon.
Yeah.
I think the world record
is from the Great Lakes.
The Great Lakes, and it kind of looks like a weird coho salmon. It's too big in my opinion.
Yeah.
So that's they're not. And the problem is that now that those salmon have been established, now you try and reestablish Atlantic salmon in places like Ontario, they're finding it very difficult because now they're these pesky, aggressive Pacific salmon as juveniles using the streams the Atlantic salmon used to use. So not only has the sort of native biodiversity of the Great Lakes been impacted by devastation wrought by the sea lamprey and then bringing Pacific salmon in, but now the restoration efforts are a lot harder because number one, you've got fish in there that now people value, which is fine, Pacific salmon, and that's making the native species, the Atlantic salmon, really hard to restore because it's being outcompeted in many cases by the Pacific salmon.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, so once you break something, it's a lot harder to put it together.
Right. Yeah.
Particularly in biology.
Okay. Yeah. And would you say in British Columbia it's still relatively untouched of freshwater ecosystem? Compared to the rest of North America?
Certainly not compared to, say, somewhere like Alaska.
Yeah.
But I would say we're still pretty good.
Yeah.
We had a history, for instance. So there's also the problem of, as you mentioned, taking a Slim Creek Chinook salmon and trying to dump them into the Nechako River to restore Chinook salmon. There's also introducing fish of the same species but from different populations.
Right.
In British Columbia, certainly the province in large part, has had, for instance, for steelhead, this idea that we should only be restoring populations with the sort of native broodstock that are found, if possible, from that system. And we've had a pretty forward-thinking sort of fish management strategy in terms of trying to maintain the natural diversity we have. There aren't enough people monitoring it, and there isn't enough money going to restore habitat, restore fishes that have gone down. But at least we haven't mucked things up too much. And when we have, for instance, introducing brook trout, or principally brook trout, or introducing rainbow trout into lakes, necessarily where, say, in the presence of cutthroat trout, where they didn't evolve with, we've gone to new strategies like trying to make sterile males and things like that, or brook trout removal programs, and only keeping them in lakes that we know, we're pretty sure they can't get out.
Yeah. And those are very sustainable lake fisheries.
Well, yeah, they're
really enjoyable. I really enjoy catching them in those lakes.
Yeah,
and they grow to pretty big size.
Yeah, that's right. And the brook trout, or speckles, as my friends from the East call them, they're marvelous fish. We just don't want to spread them everywhere. It's got to be thoughtful, and I think things like the organization like the Freshwater Fishery Society of BC does a great job at that. They've got some good people who are really thinking about trying to balance fishing opportunities with preserving the natural diversity of fish we have here.
Okay, yeah. So what can people do when it comes to preservation of native species, and how can we prevent, I guess, the expansion of introductory species population?
Never move a fish from one place to another.
Yeah.
Never release people. Many times, people's hearts are in the right place, and this goldfish has grown too big. I'm going to put it in this little pond because there's nothing in that little pond. Don't ever do that. That's biological pollution, and it's once they get out, they can spread, and it can be really, really disastrous for things.
Well, look at Dragon Lake.
Exactly, Dragon Lake. Someplace, exactly. And the thing is, a lot of people, they'll look at a slough and they'll go, that looks pretty dark water. There's no fish in there. That sort of stuff. I guarantee you, put a minnow trap in there, it'll come out chock full of beautiful coho salmon about that big, or cutthroat trout. It's amazing what lives in places where you think there's nothing there.
Yeah.
So don't move fish around, whatever you do. Donate them to a museum like us. We'll take them, and we'll use them in education.
Okay, so you do take specimens.
Definitely.
People bring them in. Okay, yeah. Going back a little bit about talking about, I guess, what you think is lifeless. One of the issues coming up lately was the accessing gravel with vehicles along the Fraser River down along Chinook, and people think there are no fish living in this area. But in fact, those wetlands are critical habitats for salmon, for juvenile salmon. Right. I would say they're just as important as not catching too many adult fish to protect juvenile salmon in the habitat. Right?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, and I'm glad you brought that up, because we've been spending a lot of time on invasive species. Habitat loss and habitat destruction is way, way more important to the decline of native fishes than any invasive species, by far.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, by far.
Yeah.
Loss of habitat, or as you mentioned, with the driving around trucks in off-channel areas and places like that, destruction of habitat alteration is the #1 cause of fish impairment, freshwater fish impairment around the world, by far.
Yeah.
So just don't do it, because those areas really are critical. And fish, like the exploitation rate on sockeye salmon in the Fraser River fishery, when we had one more consistently, was very, very high, upwards of 70 or 80%. And in Alaska, the exploitation rate is very high. But if you give the fish good habitat with which to, once the fish escape and are spawning, you give them good habitat in which to complete the rest of their life cycle, they'll bounce back. They'll pay you back in spades.
Right.
But if you muck up the habitat, that's putting a nail in the coffin for these fish.
Right. Yeah. Now I'll give you a good story since you're bringing that up. My wife's from Denmark, and for the last 20 years we've been traveling over there. I fished there once in a while as well.
Nice.
And about 20 years ago, Atlantic salmon were known as extinct in a lot of the rivers. A lot of the rivers have been channelized back in the 60s for agriculture reasons, and but one of the years, about 20 years ago, a few salmon started coming back, just out of nowhere. And they discovered that, and they took advantage of that by dechannelizing that particular river, and did some enhancement, some hatchery work, but a lot of habitat work. and now it's actually a viable, sustainable sport fishery in that river now.
Yeah.
And they get salmon up to like 20 kilograms
Yeah,
back.
yeah.
Now, huge Atlantic
Beautiful
salmon.
Atlantic salmon, yeah.
Yeah, just by seeing a few fish back, and
Yeah.
so you never.
Never write them off.
Yeah, never write them off
give 'em a
because
chance.
they're pretty resilient.
They are.
Yeah.
I mean, a local example is the removal of the Elwha Dam on the Olympic Peninsula.
Yeah.
They took down the lower dam, the Elwha Dam. They took that down. Within that same season, there were steelhead and Chinook salmon poking their way past the former dam site. Within the same season.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It really is amazing.
Yeah, you make it available and they'll use it.
They'll use it.
Okay, so let's talk about the Biodiversity Museum here at UBC. This museum has been around for just over 10 years, I believe.
That's right.
10
It
years.
opened in 2010.
Yeah, it's an amazing place. I've been here a few times now, and always, well, as a biology, someone who's passionate about biology, I love coming back here, looking at different specimens and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And we talk about how that you get quite a few visitors,
Yes.
young families coming in.
Yeah, we do. So the museum opened to the public in 2010, but that was in a new facility, and the collections we have, ranging everything from plants to insects to fishes to mammals, they've been around for some cases over 100 years, but they're all in separate locations in the Biosciences building. So they brought them all together, 2.1 million specimens, into a 20,000 square foot public facility. And yeah, it's been quite successful. We get, in normal years, we get over 40,000 people a year, mostly young families and elementary and high school students. It's very big. We have a very big and very successful public education program, principally through the schools and young families. So there's all sorts of things. We have wonderful staff who are, unlike me, are young and really enthusiastic for teaching young kids. Lots of hands-on activities. You can touch lots of stuff here. A lot of places you go, oh, don't touch that, don't touch that.
Yeah.
99% of our specimens are actually open, out in the public gallery.
Yeah. 2.1 million specimens.
Yes.
How many species are there?
Oh boy.
Just roughly, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good question. Unfortunately, I can't have the answer, but I can tell you, it's sort of, for fishes, we have about 850,000 specimens.
Yeah.
But that's spread across only a little under 4,000 species.
Oh wow. Yeah.
So we have lots of some species, like we have tons and tons of rainbow trout.
Yeah.
And not so many seahorses.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
and not just native species. We're talking about species
Oh yeah. We have
everywhere,
we have freshwater fishes from Southeast Asia, Easter Island, Alaska, Australia, all over the place.
Yeah.
It's a global collection, although clearly we specialize in fishes of northwestern Canada and the U.S.
Right. Yeah. And what do you hope people get out of it when they come here?
What we all hope they get out of it are two things. One is just how amazing biodiversity is. Some people may be more into plants, other people are more into insects, other people, I can't imagine why you wouldn't be mostly into fish. Some people are mostly into fish. And just the tremendous diversity of other animals out there other than human beings. And also I hope they get a sense of what we do here at UBC in order to study how this biodiversity originates, why it's important to preserve it, and how we can go about preserving it. So learn a little bit about what we do out here at UBC, but mostly just be blown away by, my goodness, I had no idea there were that many of these kind of things.
Yeah, just appreciate.
Yeah,
I guess.
and the strange forms, and the strange life histories, the strange behaviors that some of these fish have, and other animals and plants as well.
And that's kind of the reason we were doing this video, not just fishing, it's to kind of show you, that you appreciate how many species of fish there are out there.
Yeah.
But also just kind of inspire some of, like, we do have a lot of younger viewers, a lot of teens, even elementary school kids watching this video, and they get inspired by this, and they'll come out and they want to study fish, which I think is great. We can always use more stewards.
Yes, indeed. Yep, for sure.
In fish. So
well, as they say, you don't care about something until you know about a little bit. You care about the people in the world that you know best. And that's the same thing with types of biodiversity. And we have, we reopened in mid-June. We've got all the safety protocols and things like that for people who want to come out. And over spring break, we've had hundreds of people come, all in a very safe environment. And so it's a safe place to come. Yeah.
Let's talk about the fish ID booklet you got.
Oh, sure.
There.
Oh, right, okay.
That's been around for a little bit, and we've given away quite a few of those in the videos, and this is published by you.
That's right.
Co-published by you, and it's got freshwater fish species in British Columbia.
That's right. Yeah. It's got the 70 or so freshwater species in British Columbia plus 17 introduced fish. It's a foldable, tear-proof, completely waterproof guide with really nice pictures assembled by my colleague Derek Tan, who does all the sort of graphic design here at the museum, and people donated pictures. We're always looking for new pictures, and it's got little tidbits about their life history and their distribution, and it's just a handy guide to have. You can play games about what's different between that fish and this fish, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very handy. We've given out and sold more than 1,000. It's in its fourth printing right now. There's always one or two little boo-boos that I always correct, but and that's available here at the Beaty Museum. It's also available. You can get it through going to my website that maybe Rod will put on.
Yeah, so you can get it online. We'll put the link on the bottom for you to access it. You can purchase it from there as well.
And particularly for I'm always willing to give away the odd free copy because the point here is not to make money. The point is to celebrate the amazing diversity of freshwater fishes.
You're not getting rich from doing
No, it goes for $11. That includes postage if you order it online, and all the proceeds go to museum, not to me.
Yeah, great. And there's a new app.
Yes.
Kind of similar to that guide as well.
That's correct. The new version of the guide that's coming out has an advertisement for the app that you can get at the App Store and on Google Play.
So the app, it's what's the app for?
Well, the app is for identifying fishes, but what it does is, so this guide here is really, you look at the picture and you go, oh, it kind of looks like that, it kind of looks like this. The app is a question and answer. You scroll through a series of questions with very, very nicely illustrated images done by Derek again, and you answer yes or no, and every time you answer yes or no, the number of fish species drops down. So you eliminate some, and you eventually get to what you think, what the species is. And even if you don't use the question and answer, you just hit one button, and it gives you a list of all the freshwater fish species in BC with some beautiful pictures, some of which you've contributed that are coming in the new version. And it gives you a little life history synopsis, where they're found in British Columbia, and some details of their conservation issues related to their conservation. So it's basically like having a textbook on your phone. But it's not pages and pages of information. They're very succinct, small little sound bites with great photographs. And we're always interested in, we can load as many photos on here as you want, as we want. So we're always interested in really great contributions of photos from people who are out catching fish. And that goes for $5.50. And again, all the proceeds go to the museum.
To the museum, yeah. So it's process of elimination when it comes to identifying organisms, fish.
That's right.
Yeah, and it's important to do that. We need when you go on the fish, you need to know what you're catching.
That's right.
So you're not retaining the wrong fish, and
that's
you're not
right.
killing protected fish species. And,
that's right.
Yeah, it's really
so it's meant as there's my colleague Patrick Martone, who's the brains behind all the programming. He has one called Seaweed Sorter that you use as you walk on the beach. Oh, what kind of algae is that? What kind of algae is that? And you can imagine, say you're fishing in Deca Lake or something, and you're with your grandson, and your grandson catches a kokanee, and he goes, "Oh, look, Grandpa, what kind of fish is this?" And of course, you know what it is. What are you going to tell him? Oh, it's a kokanee. But why not? You can use the app, and you can point through pictures, and you can say, well, does it have this character or that character? And you can play a little game.
Yeah, it's like a little game.
It's like a little game. That's right. But it's not that it has to be educational, but it is.
Yeah.
But it helps you learn the parts of the fish. It helps you learn a little bit about where they're found and why they're found there, and so that sort of stuff.
Great, yeah. Okay, again, now we'll put the link on the bottom for you to get the app as well. So yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rick. It's
Rod, always a pleasure.
Pleasure to come out every time, and I know we did the last video 2 years ago. I'm always happy to come out, not just to show everyone the fish, but every time I come out, I'm learning something new myself as well, which is fantastic. And don't just say that in front of the video, but yeah, it's great.
You're probably going to edit this part out because you're probably embarrassed if I say something like this. But the thing I really like about your videos is you take a very broad view of the value of fish. Everything, you're a hardcore fisherman and you have all the techniques dialed down, but you do other things like this that some people might find interesting to sort of open another window about, oh, I really never thought about the fish that a rainbow trout eats. And that's what we need. If you want to keep the fish that we really value, you got to keep all the things underneath them too.
Yeah. So even if we inspire 10 people in this video, I think it makes a difference.
Yeah. Well, right on. Right on.
Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome. Thanks. Come back again.
Yeah, for sure.